Hi, John from New Bay Financial Partners, looking at investment markets. As sort of expected, Fed Chairman Jay Powell sort of kept a pretty tough line out there, sort of saying that potentially the Fed still hasn't done yet, possibly one or two more rate hikes to come. But that will still be very much dependent on data. And what is quite interesting that sort of on the way up here with inflation rising, it was really headline that was leading the way and core was sort of lagging behind. Now you've almost got the reverse where core is sort of a little bit stubborn and only coming down sort of gradually, whereas headline is sort of falling quite dramatically. But certainly it has been a pretty reasonable first 6 months for US equities. They're up around sort of 15%, give or take. And also what is quite interesting is the real Fed funds rate now is actually positive, whereas a year ago that was quite heavily negative. Now on the back of these comments, US interest rates have moved just a little bit. 2 years around 476, the 10 years around 376. So that's certainly up from what it was sort of 3 to 4 weeks ago. Now obviously it'll be interesting the next sort of couple of days as we come to sort of a month end and also quarter end as well in the US. And then obviously you've got the big Thanksgiving holiday next week. Quite interesting as well in the presidential election, the sort of news. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has come out and said that possibly ex-President Trump may not be the strongest GOP candidate. Because obviously, despite sort of Trump leading in the polls for the Republican nomination, still facing some pretty major issues on the legal front. Now, obviously, the other big news was in Russia with a sort of a potential sort of military coup sort of put down the Wagner Group, led by Prigozhin, has sort of turned and sort of headed up towards Moscow and got within sort of 300 kilometers Moscow before a very fragile sort of peace deal was negotiated through Belarus. Now, not surprisingly, Putin has come out and said the Wagner troops, they were traitors and they will be dealt with harshly. But again, what is interesting, because if you take the Wagner sort of soldiers out of the Ukraine conflict, Russia's really left with very few sort of heavily trained fighting forces. Now, potentially, as this started the demise of President Putin, certainly does weaken his power quite dramatically, despite what he comes out and says. Now, quite surprisingly, oil has sort of come back on that sort of news. Most people thought it would actually sort of spike higher, but it's actually come lower in trading. It's currently around 67.50 and change. Now, inflation in the UK reaches a 31-year high. And not surprisingly, on the back of that, the Bank of England increased interest rates by 50 basis points. That was a little bit of a surprise. To take the base rate to 5%. Now, potentially, people are now talking about a 6% peak in the base rate. Now in Europe, just waiting to see what the sort of fallout is from this sort of internal wranglings within Russia and the potential sort of issues. and implications on the Ukraine-Russian war. But certainly as well, with the warmer weather now coming into Europe, the European economies are looking for a major sort of boost in terms of sort of summer tourist spending. Now in Australia, potentially the economy gets a little bit of a further boost with two of the key interest rates in China being cut to try and stimulate a little bit more economic activity out there. And that coupled with the housing market that is starting to sort of show signs of some pretty reasonable recovery coming through, although potentially the Reserve Bank could be looking at increasing interest rates again at its July the 4th meeting. Now here in New Zealand, obviously still gripped with a major sort of cost of living crisis, and it's just going to be very interesting because potentially, because in 2 days' time the fuel subsidy comes off and they'll put an extra 25 cents on a litre of fuel. And certainly many political analysts are actually sort of discussing the sort of merits of this because with the election now just 4 months away, it's going to be pretty hard for the government to spin that as a positive move. They're waiting for the Reserve Bank for its next meeting because they've come out and said that rates are where they need to be now. They're not going any higher, so it'll just be very interesting to see what commentary comes out at the next meeting. Also as well, you've got a couple of days left to try and get those KiwiSaver balances up if you haven't contributed enough to get that maximum government contribution. Now it's going to be interesting for the New Zealand economy because certainly many of the sort of hospitality and sort of tourist operators are hoping for a bit of a bump at sort of winter, although at present the weather's not really playing ball. Certainly not cold enough really for a lot of the ski fields. Indeed, one of the ski fields sort of did open, then had to close down a week later because it just wasn't cold enough and the snow was melting. Now, if you are looking for income options, go to the website www.bayfinancialpartners.co.nz for lots of interesting articles. I look forward to speaking to you soon.